Holly came from Miami, FLA, hitchhiked her way across the USA, plucked her eyebrows on the way, shaved her legs, and then he was a she and said, "Hey, babe, take a walk on the wild side." Those, of course, are the lyrics to Walk on the Wild Side by Lou Reed about the wonderful, fabulous, mysterious, glamorous Miss Holly Woodlawn. Although Holly Woodlawn herself had a slightly different take on things, she said, "It's a wonder I even survived this walk on the wild side." Although to say I was walking makes it sound so pleasant. Honey, I trudged, I crawled, I groveled, and sometimes I waltzed. Holly was a hoot, and she was a little bit different than her peers, Candy Darling and Jackie Curtis. Candy Darling wanted to be this glamorous star, and Jackie Curtis was this brainy playwright who wanted to be taken seriously as an artist. And Holly, well, according to Holly, she said, "I didn't have any dreams. I had nerve. Plain, gutsy, risk-taking nerve." And that's the truth. Holly was under no delusions. She did not think she was some glamorous star. She knew she was a lowlife in the gutter, but she had such a sense of humor about it. And I can't wait to tell you about her life because it's crazy. But before we get into everything, hi, my name is Kate, and I am the creator of The Factory, which is an immersive show about the world of Andy Warhol and the events that led to his attempted assassination by Valerie Solanas. It is a wild show. Basically, you as the audience are invited to a party at the factory where you can help silkscreen paintings, sit for your own screen test, help film an underground movie, rock out with the live band, and maybe even be named Andy Warhol's next superstar. We just did a workshop at $3 Bill in Brooklyn last month. It was amazing, and now I'm fundraising to do a full production at the end of 2025 of this show, and I can't wait to show you the whole show. It is just insane. But that is for the future. Oh, also, before we get into it, I did want to announce another fun update. I am now offering astrology readings. I am a huge astrology girly. I've been doing astrology for years. You maybe noticed this wall hanging behind me. I also based the structure of The Factory on the astrology wheel. It is a show that is an hour long. It's broken up into 12 scenes. It's based on the circular nature of time. It also features 12 characters. It's very spooky, very woo. But all that to say, I'm very into astrology, and I would love to tell you about your birth chart. So my website will be in the video description below. If you want to book a reading with me, I would love to talk to you and tell you about the stars. I am all about stars, stars in the sky, stars on the screen, everything stars. So book a reading if you would like. And with all that being said, let's talk about Holly Woodlawn. Oh, also, subscribe to the channel. I always forget to say this, but it is very important. Please subscribe. I would love to have you here. I am always making videos on old Hollywood and Warhol superstars and punk rock history and art history and the many ways that pop culture recycles itself. So, love to have you on the channel. Hit subscribe for more content just like this. And now, without further ado, let's talk about Holly Woodlawn. Hi, welcome back. I'm excited you are here. Okay, before we get into everything, I do have to do my traditional kind of warning up top about language. I said this in my Candy Darling video and my Jackie Curtis video, but I will say it again. We are talking about people that existed in 1960s, the 1970s, and the language around people who were trans or who were drag queens, who were gender nonconforming, was very different then than it is now. So I, for the most part, will be referring to Holly and everybody that I mentioned in this video the way that they referred to themselves. So if you hear me say something that is like, that doesn't sound right, it should be this is the wrong pronoun, that sort of thing, I am trying to be aware and conscious of how these people talked about themselves. So don't come for me. All right, let's start talking about Holly Woodlawn for real. So Miss Holly Woodlawn was born Geraldo Santiago Franceschi Rodriguez Dan Huckle. I apologize if I have butchered that name. I probably have, but that was Miss Holly's name when she was born. She was born in Puerto Rico in 1946, and she was raised in a huge family. Growing up, Holly was the youngest of many cousins, aunts, uncles, just this huge family in Puerto Rico, and she had a wonderful memory of growing up in her early childhood in Puerto Rico. And her mom was, at the time, I don't think they were ever married, or they were married very briefly, but her mom was with her father, who was an American GI. She got pregnant. The American father stays for a little while and then bounces pretty fast. So young Harold did not grow up with a father figure in his life. However, that did not really matter to Harold because his family was so huge, and it also was kind of the tradition for the women in the family to go off, get married, meet a man. They all kind of married low life, no good for nothing type dudes. The men would turn out to be trash. They would beat the women, what have you. Eventually, the aunts would all come back to the family home. So it was a lot of Harold's aunts with kids, no dads, but he did have his grandma and his grandpa. So, and he called his grandma Mommy because Mommy pretty much raised him as, at least in Harold's early childhood, Mommy was like the maternal figure. And then Poppy, the grandfather, was there too. So young Harold is growing up in Puerto Rico with this huge family, aunts, cousins, pigs, chickens, Mommy and Poppy, and having a wonderful time. Holly, Harold at the time, loved living in Puerto Rico. And because Harold's dad had run out when Harold was so young, Harold's mom decides to go to America to try and make something of herself, but she wants to go to America and kind of get settled before she sends for her child. So Holly's mom moves away, and I have to say up top, I'm already noticing that I'm switching between Harold and Holly. I apologize. I'm trying to give you a sense of who this person was at the time, but of course we know who she became. So I don't know, comment below if you have an opinion on how best to tackle these kinds of stories. I would love to hear your thoughts because I want to be authentic and honest and respectful, and these things are kind of tricky. So anyways, young Harold is, and by the way, also in the book, Holly refers to herself as Holly and Harold sometimes, so I'm not doing anything that Holly didn't do. I don't know why I feel like I need to defend myself so much, but I do. You know how the internet is. Okay, so anyways, when Holly's mom goes to America, she lives there by herself for a little while. Holly stays in Puerto Rico. And in America, Holly's mom moves to New York City. She starts working as a waitress, and she meets this Polish immigrant who had escaped the Nazis as a teenager, who was also working as a waiter at the same restaurant. And they fall in love, and they kind of like that they have this shared experience of both being immigrants to this new country and kind of starting from scratch. And so they really bond. And the father, or the man that Holly's mother marries, is very excited to learn that she has a son. And so he's happy to bring young Harold over. And so when Harold is about 9 years old, he moves from Puerto Rico to New York City and moves in with his mom and his mom's new husband. And they become this new family unit. And honestly, things are great. That the one through line through all of this story is no matter how wild Holly becomes, her parents are always there for her, which I think is really amazing, especially for the time. I don't think anybody else in these stories that I have said have had such supportive parents. I think maybe Holly has some of the most supportive parents in the factory. Very, very likely. So they're living in New York City, and then one day Holly's stepfather hears that there's this really fancy hotel that's going to be open in Miami. And it's supposed to be the most glamorous, most high class, huge hotel. And he's like, that's money. Because remember, both Holly's mother and stepfather, they're both waiters. They both work in restaurants. So they decide that they're going to go make their fortune in Miami. And so the very small 3-person family moves to Miami so that Harold's parents can work as waiters at this fabulous hotel. So they moved to Miami, and Holly loves it because it is very similar to Puerto Rico. And so she's vibing with the scene. Her parents are working at this big hotel, and she starts to wander around, learn the neighborhood, and she goes to the beach all the time. And she discovers that across the street from the library, where she likes to go and get books, is the gay beach of Miami. And at the time, Holly's at this point like 13, 14, isn't really even out to herself. Doesn't know there's other people out there like her. And so when she goes to this gay beach, she's like enamored with the whole scene. And something that is really striking to her is that she had heard about gay people, but at the time they had all these nicknames, like queers, pansies, Nancy's, fairies, very like effeminate names, derogatory slur type names. And when Holly goes to the gay beach, she's like, oh, it's all types of men. It's like short, tall, bald, fat. Everybody is represented here. It's everybody can be gay. And that is very eye-opening to Holly. So Holly starts hanging out at the gay beach in Miami, and she's starting to like really kind of find her tribe. And she makes friends with all of these gay boys at the gay beach in Miami. And she wants a little bit of freedom. And so she realizes that her dad, who has this, well, her stepfather, has this brand new 1962 Chevy convertible. And he would drive it to the hotel for work. And then he would work 9 hours with the car just sitting in the parking lot, not being used. And then he would get off work and drive it home. And so Holly's like, well, the car is just being wasted sitting in this parking lot, unused, 9 hours out of the day. So Holly sneaks the car keys out of her mother's purse, takes them to the hardware store, gets a copy made for herself, sneaks them back, puts them back in the mother's purse, and then gives the car keys to her older friends, because she's still like 14 at this point. And they have this new routine where in the morning they meet at the hotel, they take the car, they drive it all around town all day, party it up, and then they take it back to the hotel before Holly's father gets off of work, and then he drives it home none the wiser. And this goes on for a couple weeks, and Holly's having a grand time until the inevitable happens, which is that Holly's dad gets off work early one night and goes out to the parking lot, and the car is gone. And of course assumes that the car has been stolen and calls the police. So the police come, and they're still in the parking lot, like making up the police report, when the car comes screaming into the parking lot full of all of these gay boys, and they're like screaming at the top of their lungs, he's so fine, do-lang, do-lang, do-lang. Like they're just singing and yelling and being crazy. And he is mad. I think you can imagine he was furious. It wasn't just that the car was stolen. It was the deception that Holly had orchestrated, and also who had stolen the car, because Holly's not out at this point. Holly is just little Harold, mild-mannered Harold. And so Holly's dad takes her home and confronts her in front of the mom and is demanding to know, like, did you know this was going to happen? Holly is denying it up and down. She swears that she doesn't know these boys. She had no idea the car was stolen. Eventually, her dad does not give up. He knows what happened. And so he eventually gets it out of her that, yes, she was the one behind this stealing of the car. Yes, these are her friends. And her dad is like, do you know what these boys are? Basically saying, like, do you know that these are gay boys? And Holly says, no, I don't. I had no idea. I don't know. Until her dad keeps pressing her and is like, you knew these boys were queer. And in a fit of dramatics, like hysterical, she's like, yes, I'm gay. And then she picks up the ashtray, a glass ashtray, and smashes it on the ground, and then takes the glass shards and starts cutting her wrists. She only manages a few like surface scratches, but really it is the dramatic thought that counts. Of course, this is made all the worse by the fact that Harold's stepfather had just legally adopted him like a few days before this whole car stealing incident. So the guilt and shame are heavy at this point, and Harold is sent to a correctional facility called, Youth Hall. And it's basically like it's not quite conversion therapy, but it's along the same lines. And it only serves to make Harold more ashamed, more angry, more disillusioned. And he starts to feel like Miami is not for him. He needs to get out. And he happens to have another friend at the same time named Russell, who also, he's gay and he's also really ready to get out of Miami. And so the two of them hatch this plan where they're going to go to New York City. Of course, Harold already lived in New York City for a few years as a young kid. Russell, I don't think has ever been, but Harold's down. He's like, yeah, let's go back to New York City. I actually hate Miami. And so they start plotting, and Harold, in an effort to get money for this trip, steals one of his mother's bracelets with 23 aquamarines in it, and he pawns it. And he only gets $27 for this bracelet, which is embarrassing, especially because he stole it from his mom to like run away. He feels a lot of shame. And in fact, in the book, he said that for many years, he told people that he got the money for this trip by saving it from his paper route. But that is not true. He stole this bracelet. He pawns it for $27. And him and Russell get a one-way ticket to Georgia. That's about as far as they can get with $27. And so they take the train. They end up in New Brunswick, Georgia, and they're out of money. And so Holly calls her parents and is tearful and is like, she confesses to everything. I ran away. I'm so sorry. I want to come home. Can you send money? They're so happy to hear from Harold. So they send him money expecting him to come home. But when the money comes through a wire transfer, Harold's like, oh, good. And they just keep going to New York City. So kind of, a scammer a little bit from the beginning. So on this trip from Georgia to New York City, Holly undergoes quite a transformation. First, she takes pliers and she pulls the braces off of her teeth. And then, like the song says, she plucks her eyebrows because Russell had been doing this already. And so Russell shows Holly how to pluck her eyebrows. She shaves her legs. The stories are true. And she is enamored with how she looks. She felt like when she looked like a girl, everything made sense. She was a pretty girl. When she looked like a boy, she was just kind of like gangly and ugly, and it didn't work for her. Becoming a woman was the thing that really made sense to Holly. And that goes back really to like her childhood. So she starts dressing as a woman. She starts dressing feminine. And by the time they get to New York City, Holly is feeling the fantasy. But they get to New York City, and when they get to Times Square, they are greeted by this huge, like 30-foot, huge, tall billboard of Liz Taylor in Cleopatra. She is starring in Cleopatra, and it is like the most iconic thing to Holly when they get to New York City. Of course, they have no money to go see the film because they spend pretty much everything they had to get there. And so they are living on the streets, essentially, and after like 2 weeks of this, Russell is like, I'm out. And so he goes back to Miami, but Harold's there, I think mostly because she was too ashamed to go back because she had stolen the bracelet to get to Georgia and then called pretending to come home to get the money to get to New York City. So she really couldn't call again. And she was so embarrassed and ashamed. And she felt like a freak and that her parents hated her and like they had rejected her for being gay. And so she just feels like she has to stay. And she's only like 15. So she's 15 years old and she is now living on the streets of Manhattan. And after kind of like bouncing around from place to place, she ends up in Bryant Park, I believe. And kind of starts hanging out with these like trans women and drag queens and gay kids that were all from Miami. And so she fits in really well with them. And it turns out that they all shared like one hotel room. And they would pool their money. So they would all kind of like hustle on the street during the day or really the night. They would turn tricks, and then whatever money they made, they would pool to pay for the rent for this one hotel room. And so she kind of is adopted into this gang. And so she is expected to contribute to the pool. And Harold is not good at this. Despite her best efforts. In fact, one of my favorite Woodlawn quotes is that she says she was a disgrace to the world's oldest profession. She really couldn't do it. Sometimes she would wander up and down the streets all night and no one would take her up on the goods. Sometimes she would go with a John, but then she would get too nervous to ask for the money afterwards. She just was kind of insecure. I mean, she's 15 years old, so she does her best, but she's really not good at the whole trick turning thing, at least at this point. So she's homeless for a few years, and then eventually she reaches a point where she's really down on her luck. And so she calls her parents, and they, of course, are thrilled to hear from her because they have no idea what happened. It's been years now. And so they pay for her to come back to Miami, and she stays with them for a little while. And it's actually while she's back that JFK is assassinated. And she happens to be sitting in the living room with her father when JFK is assassinated. And it just like kind of brings everything into focus, and it's like it feels like the world is going crazy, everything's upside down. And she tells her parents that they want her to have some sort of direction in life, and she tells them that she wants to go to beauty school. And so they decide that they will pay for her tuition to go to beauty school, and she wants to do it in Manhattan. So they give her some money to go to beauty school, and Harold goes back to Manhattan. So once Holly gets back to New York City, she enrolls in beauty school, and one night she's hanging out in Greenwich Village when she meets her first real friend in the city. And it's Jimmy Slattery, aka Miss Candy Darling. And the way that Holly describes it is this. She says, "One night I saw this vision like nothing I had ever seen before, and it was a creature underneath a lamppost, and she had on bangs. It was her Audrey Hepburn look with these glasses on top of her head and a big fluffy sweater. I really thought it was the most beautiful creature I had ever seen in my life. I wasn't sure if it was a man or a woman. I was pretty sure it was a guy, but it looked so beautiful. And she was having a fight with some of these street hustlers, and he threw an ice cream cone in her face. And I remember feeling so bad, but she was kind of snippy and snotty. She had an attitude problem. So we became friends." So Jimmy, that's how she was known at the time, was kind of had a reputation of being like a little too good. She had a reputation on the streets for being snotty and stuck up and like not really talking to people. Holly, on the other hand, she understood the value of having hustler friends because she had been living on the streets. So they would buy cigarettes and candy and sodas and kind of like share their loot with the girls, but they also would offer protection. And you also had to be nice to them because there was the possibility that they could turn on you and reveal your true sex to a John. So you had to be nice. You really needed to be on the hustler's good side. And Jimmy, I think she was going by Hope Slattery at this point. She did not understand this need to be kind to people for your own protection. And so, but Holly doesn't really mind. And so she starts hanging out with Jimmy / Hope / eventually Candy Darling. And at the time, I don't know what we're just going to say Candy. Candy was living in Long Island with her mother. And it's very interesting because I had been under the impression that Candy's mom was like deeply ashamed of Candy, and I think that probably was true. But in Holly's memoir, she says that Candy's mom actually, like, as long as Candy wasn't going outside and letting the neighbors know that she was dressing as a woman, Candy's mom was fine with it. And actually, Candy's mom was also a huge old movie fan, and so she loved Candy dressing up like these old movie stars. I thought that was very interesting. I hadn't heard that before. So Candy's living in Long Island, and she calls Holly all the time. They talk on the phone, and Holly is just very impressed with Candy's encyclopedic knowledge of old Hollywood stars. And all of, Candy is constantly doing her Kim Novak impersonation, doing her monologues, like just dropping all of these like tidbits about old Hollywood history. And most of it is going over Holly's head. She doesn't really care, but she is impressed that Candy knows all of this information, and she's happy to have a friend. She's happy to just let Candy ramble on the phone about old Hollywood. She kind of loves it. And so they have this friendship, and on the weekends, Holly would take the train from Long Island into the city. They would hang out in Greenwich Village. They would like get one cup of coffee, kind of dawdle over it for as long as the people running the cafe would let them, and then they would go wander the village and do window shopping and just hang out on the streets. So Candy tells Holly that she's going to be the next Greta Garbo, and Holly thinks that she's Delulu. She really is under no delusions that this was a young boy at the time, and she really does think Candy's kind of nuts, but they share a a similar fascination with stories of like old Hollywood where glamorous young women take men for a ride and they get gifts and jewels and furs, and these men like provide a fabulous lifestyle for these like conniving women. They both kind of love these Hollywood stories. And Holly also kind of just tolerates Candy's lies about her identity. Candy often would say that she was a distant cousin of Kim Novak, which was not true. She just was obsessed with Kim Novak. But Holly doesn't care. Honestly, she's just here for a good time, which is just the definition of Holly. And so they become quite close friends. And on March 30th, 1966, Holly and Candy meet the third person that will make up their iconic trio, Jackie Curtis. They meet because they are all at a mutual friend's apartment, this guy named Seymour, who is the only person who had a television set, and they all want to watch Barbra Streisand's new special, Color Me Barbra. They all, of course, are obsessed with Barbra Streisand. And so Jackie comes over to watch this TV special and meets Holly and Candy, and they all just really hit it off. And Candy has some choice words about Jackie Curtis. She says, "That despicable dime store floozy of the three Warhol girlettes, Miss Curtis was by far the least convincing and the most conniving. That tramp was to womanhood what snags are to nylons." But they love each other. They really do. In fact, they get along so well that the three trans girls, well, Jackie is not a trans woman. Jackie kind of exists outside of gender, but Candy and Holly are very much trans women, and they start to call themselves Shotzi, Pola, and Loco, which is the three heroines of the 1953 film How to Marry a Millionaire, which is basically the story of three fashionable women in New York City as they scheme to snag rich husbands, only to realize that money isn't everything. But it really is kind of an iconic comparison. Candy is Pola, the Marilyn Monroe character, who is beautiful, dreamlike, living in kind of a self-created fantasy. Holly is a Loco, the Betty Grable character, who's kind of the fun and wild one. And Jackie is Shotzi, who's the Lauren Bacall character, who's like the smart, sharp, literary, intellectual one. And so they become very good friends. So Holly and Candy are friends. Jackie Curtis has joined the mix. And around this time is when Holly actually officially starts going by Holly. She had been kind of known as Harold, but a lot of her friends called her Howie as a nickname. And so eventually Howie, she changes a letter here, a letter there, it becomes Holly. She also was pretty enamored with Holly Golightly from the Truman Capote book and then the film Breakfast at Tiffany's. So kind of a little bit of Holly Golightly, kind of a little Howie. So Holly becomes Holly officially. And around the same time, a friend of hers from the street introduces her to Dr. Benjamin, who does sex changes. And she starts seeing Dr. Benjamin for hormone therapy. And it is very different than the hormone therapy that happens today. This is obviously like very early experimental kind of treatment for hormone therapy. But Holly loves it, and she starts developing breasts. She starts looking more feminine, and she gains so much confidence. She really feels like this is who she is meant to be, and she just feels more at ease with herself. She feels much more comfortable being a pretty girl than a funny looking boy. She feels like when she's a girl, she gets attention, like good attention. And when she's a boy, she just gets harassed. So she starts wearing hip pads. Her breasts are coming in. She's dressing more feminine. She grows her hair out. She's wearing women's clothing, and she's having the best time. And she meets this boy named Jack, and Jack becomes her boyfriend. And Jack actually has a great job. He lives in Queens. And so Holly moves in with Jack, and she's living kind of her housewife fantasy. She's still going to beauty school. And so she starts leading kind of this double life. It's still pretty dangerous in the 1960s for a trans woman in New York or anywhere. And so the neighbors think that she is like a real quote unquote woman. And so she leaves her apartment in the morning dressed as a woman, and she gets on the train and she takes the train into Manhattan. And then the problem is she's enrolled in beauty school as Harold. And so When she gets into the city, she goes to the bathrooms at Grand Central Station, and she has in her bag like a pair of overalls and sneakers, and she washes off all her makeup, and she goes to beauty school as Harold. And then she's at beauty school all day as Harold the boy. And then when she gets done with school at night, she goes back to the bathrooms at Grand Central Station, puts the makeup back on, puts the girl clothes back on, takes the train home, and shows up back at home as Holly. And so she's doing this for months. And it's like, it's a pain in the ass, but it's going pretty well until one day she is kind of just not feeling it. And she figures, hey, like, I'm going to beauty school. Surely these women would not mind if I come in with a fabulous hairdo and some makeup. And they do. They actually do mind. And so she's expelled from beauty school for cross-dressing, essentially. Now, she's so upset about getting expelled from school that she takes her new credit card that her boyfriend Jack has given her, and she goes on a shopping spree, and she just buys whatever she wants. Holly ultimately is a clothes horse, and she gets all these glamorous clothes, racks up a $2,000 bill, which in 1960 whatever is a significant bill. It's still kind of a significant bill today. And when Jack finds out, he is furious. He's also furious that Jackie got expelled, and he's like, girl, you got to get a job. And so Holly starts trying to find work. She actually gets a bunch of jobs, but she quits all of them after like a few weeks because she's not really cut out for working. And so she's getting work, doing it for a while, getting fired. She like works as a model a couple different times, actually. But that also is kind of a pain, and she'd rather just drink. So she's not the best at working. Jack, on the other hand, is a very diligent, loyal boyfriend, and he also really wants to help Holly get a sex change. And so Jack saves up enough money for a sex change operation. She's going to have bottom surgery. And so she goes to this doctor in the Bronx with all the money that Jack has saved for her to get surgery. And the doctor tells her, actually, you need to be living in, this is what they said at the time. The doctor says you need to be living in drag as a woman for a year before we will do the surgery for you. And Holly's like, wait, I've been living as a woman for like the last 4 years. And the doctor's like, well, that may be true, but we need to observe you living as a woman. We need to do like psychological tests to make sure that you can handle this transition. And Holly is not here for it. She's furious, actually. She storms out of the doctor's office, and she just takes the money, and kind of on impulse, she spends all the money that Jack has saved for her operation on clothes. She just goes on a shopping spree again. That is kind of her MO when she's feeling upset, is to just go shopping. And so she spends all the money for the operation, and then she's so embarrassed and upset that she's like, I can't go back and face Jack. So she runs away to Boston and lives in Boston for like a month and kind of waits for like Jack's anger to blow over. So the year is 1968, and Holly, Jackie, and Candy are all good friends at this point, but they are not in Warhol's circle yet. The factory has by this point become a kind of a cultural phenomenon, at least in New York City. And there has been already quite a lot of drama at the factory. Edie Sedgwick has come and gone by this point. The Velvet Underground has also kind of come up from the underground, and by this point is kind of done with Andy Warhol. So the factory is at a point of like critical mass in 1968. Everything is kind of spiraling out of control. And of course, the big disaster happens in the summer of 1968 when Valerie Solanas tries to kill Andy Warhol. And she tried to kill Andy Warhol, well, one, because she was a little bit insane, but she also felt like Andy Warhol was taking advantage of her and everyone. She kind of clocked that Andy Warhol was just exploiting everybody for his own gain, and she was kind of crazy. And she had a organization that she was the founder and the only member of called SCUM, which stands for the Society for Cutting Up Men. So there had been a lot of drama at the factory, to say the least, and you can check out some of my other videos if you want to know more about what was happening at the factory during this era. But Valerie shoots Andy in 1968 around the same time that Holly gets back from Boston, and her tail is between her legs. She knows she messed up with Jack. That relationship is over. She actually gets called in front of the draft board for the Vietnam War, and she's like, I don't know what to do. So she bleaches her hair and she puts on the most like skimpy little outfit, little crop top, little booty shorts, some high heels, and she struts into the draft office. And when she is called before the draft board, she lifts up her shirt and she shows her beautiful bosom, and they are, kind of shocked and appalled that Harold has breasts, and they dismiss her from having to serve in the military. And so she's elated about that, but she is still kind of homeless. And so she goes to Jackie and Candy for help, and Jackie and Candy are not really here for her. They kind of turn up their noses and they're like, we don't know you. That is a theme throughout this story, is that these girls, we know them as like this iconic trio, Jackie, Candy, Holly, but they were often enemies as much as they were friends. They were not just good Judys all the time at all. There's a lot of infighting and insecurity. Also, at this point, Candy is starring in Glamour, Glory, and Gold off Broadway, which was a play that Jackie Curtis wrote. And Candy, who is making her stage debut, is making her stage debut with Robert De Niro, who was in his first role on stage in Glamour, Glory, and Gold. Of course, Robert De Niro at the time was not the famous actor that he is today, but Jackie and Candy are really feeling themselves because Jackie has this play that's running off Broadway and Candy is starring in it, so she gets to be the star. They are very much feeling themselves, and they have no time for Holly at this point at all. So Holly is back to living on the streets, turning tricks, and she falls in with another group of trans girls that are kind of also living on the streets, and she also starts hanging out at the Stonewall Inn. And she gets another group of friends and she moves into one room hotel room, kind of the way she did before, where it's a bunch of girls pooling their money. And they live across the hall from this woman named Miss Liz Eden. And Miss Eden is like this notorious trans hooker who is very famous in the area, and she has this boyfriend Sonny from Queens who comes to see her on a regular basis. And Sonny has a wife and kids in Queens, but he comes to see Miss Eden on the side, and every time that Sonny is going to come into town, she shouts at all the girls and she's like, Sonny is coming, Sonny's coming, he's so gorgeous. And all the girls run around like little hens and they're screaming and they're excited for Sonny to come. And then when Sonny comes, all of the girls hide and they make no sound, and they wait for, the trick to be turned and for Sonny to leave. And then they all like kiki afterwards. And this relationship is going on for a while until Sonny declares his love for Miss Eden. And he's like, I'll do anything for you. I will do literally whatever you want. And Miss Eden, she knows an opportunity when she sees it. And she was like, I want a sex change. And so in an effort to get Miss Eden what she wants, Honey robs a bank to try and pay for Miss Eden's sex change. And you may be saying, wait, I think I've heard this story before. Yes, it became the plot of a film called Dog Day Afternoon. And I think this actually happens a couple times in Holly's memoir, that she just like kind of turns up at the scene of the crime of like these iconic famous events. But I just thought that that was interesting, that at this point in her life, when she's on the outs with Jackie and Candy, she has befriended another iconic trans woman. So Holly is hanging out at the Stonewall Inn, and she meets this guy named Silver George, who was a regular at the factory in kind of the early days. And I honestly had never heard of Silver George until I read this memoir, but he sounds like an interesting person. And he had this boyfriend, and they would go to Stonewall together where where Holly was hanging out. And Holly is so impressed by Silver George, not just because he is a factory regular, but because he is so smart, so witty. Both him and his boyfriend are like just so quick and funny and fast. And she's just really impressed with their intellect, and they get along really well. And so Holly ends up moving in with Silver George and his boyfriend. And she discovers, once she moves in, the secret to their quick wit. It's, as you may have guessed if you have watched any of my factory videos, It's amphetamine, baby. And Holly is kind of horrified. She may be a low-life hooker, but she's not a junkie. And she thinks that being a junkie is kind of like the lowest rung on the totem pole. It's like the worst thing you can be. And these guys are like shooting up heroin, I mean, shooting up amphetamines with needles. And she's kind of terrified, but they're like, Holly, it's not that big of a deal. Calm down. Try some speed. And so they get her to do it, and she loves it. And so she quickly falls in to this, lifestyle of living with Silver George and his boyfriend and doing speed. And it turns out they're not just doing speed, they are drug dealers. They are selling speed. And so she starts to meet some of their other friends. And one day, this guy comes to the apartment to hang out and to get speed. And it's this man named Ondine. And you can watch my Ondine video if you would like to learn more about Ondine. Ondine is one of Warhol's earliest superstars, and I was so intrigued to read Holly's memoir talking about him because Ondine is one of those people that is very hard to get information about. There is very little like real biographical details out there about Ondine. And my impression of Ondine, he was really kind of instrumental in the early factory days, like 1962 to 1965, I would say, is like the Ondine years at the factory. So I was surprised to hear that post 1968, he was still hanging around factory people. And I also was shocked to hear Holly describe him as this very strange man with a severe stutter. Apparently, by 1968, he had this very terrible stutter, and it would take him forever just to get a sentence out, which is kind of the opposite of the Ondine that I have heard about. The Ondine that I know is quick-witted, fast, fiercely intelligent, could rip you to shreds at any moment. And I'm very curious. I don't know if maybe he had a stutter from childhood and amphetamines like helped him get past that, or if he developed a stutter as an adult, maybe as a result of his amphetamine use. I don't know. I have never heard of Ondine having a stutter, so I thought that was really crazy. So Holly starts hanging out with Ondine at the house. They're all doing amphetamines. And one day, Ondine manages to get out the sentence through his stutter that he thinks Holly is gorgeous. She's so beautiful, and she just has to meet Andy Warhol. And this is what Holly has been dreaming of, because at this moment, Holly knows that Candy Darling and Jackie Curtis have starred in Warhol's film Flesh. So Candy Darling and Jackie Curtis are Warhol superstars, which was Candy's dream. Candy is the one that was obsessed with Andy Warhol and was like fighting tooth and nail to become a Warhol superstar, because Candy knew that Warhol was probably the only person in New York City that could help Candy become a true star. And that was Candy's ultimate ambition. Holly did not really care about being a star. But the more she learned about the factory, the more she was like, oh, this place sounds like pretty crazy. And if there's anything Holly likes, it's a good time. So she knows that Andy Warhol's this famous actor, or famous artist, sorry. He was not an actor. Famously very bad at acting. But she knows that Andy Warhol is kind of like this star maker, and he has this studio, the factory. And now her friends, well, former friends, Jackie Curtis and Candy Darling, are Warhol superstars. So she's like, yes, I want to go to this party. So Ondine takes Holly to a party at the factory, and he introduces her to Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol is surrounded by all these beautiful, fabulous people. And he looks at Holly and he's like, oh, wow, you're so beautiful. You should be in one of my movies. And this is, we know, if you have been watching my videos, this was kind of something that Andy said to everybody at the factory. It was kind of his way of making small talk, because he was a very shy person. But Holly does not know that Andy says this to everybody. And actually, Andy means it. He does want to put Holly in a film. And so Holly is like, yes, of course I will be in a film. And he's like, what's your name? And Holly says, my name's Holly. And Andy was like, oh, do you have a last name? And Holly's like, no, But the next time you see me, I will have a last name. And then Andy's like, okay, and just kind of like dissolves back into the party. And Holly's like, I gotta get a last name. She has not thought that far ahead, really. I mean, like, she is living truly hand to mouth this whole time. And so Andy disappears back into the party, and Holly tries to talk to Jackie Curtis and Candy Darling because these are her former girlfriends. They have known each other for a long time, but they are very snooty. They turn up their noses again. They do not talk to Holly. So Holly's like, whatever, I don't need you. Leaves the party. She's still living with Silver George and his boyfriend. And they start trying to put their heads together and think of a good name for Holly. And I have spoken about this in many of my videos, but there was kind of this tradition at the factory. When you became a Warhol superstar, you changed your name. So famous superstar names include International Velvet, Ultraviolet, Ingrid Superstar, Billy Name. So Holly loves these, like, you know, super glam superstar names. And so she's thinking of all these ideas. Silver George, Ondine, they're all throwing out these ideas. And one night they're like, they've thought of all of these crazy ideas and none of them really sound right. And then they're watching I Love Lucy, a rerun on television. And in the episode, a bus drives by a sign that says Woodlawn, and it makes Holly think of Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And a lot of famous people are buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. And she's like, oh, I know. I'll be the heiress of Woodlawn Cemetery and go by Holly Woodlawn. And so that becomes her name, and that's the name from here on out. But before Holly can make her factory debut, something tragic happens. And that is that Judy Garland dies. It is June 26th, 1969, and every queen and gay boy in New York City is devastated when Judy Garland dies, truly. Holly is on the street and she runs into Candy Darling, who is clutching her copy, like a recording of Judy Garland, and she's sobbing. She's actually on her way to Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel for Judy Garland's funeral. And I do have to say, side note, in just a year or a couple of years, Candy Darling will have her own funeral, spoiler alert, at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. And this is now the third or fourth video in a row that I have mentioned Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. I talked about it in the Judy Garland video. I talked about it in my Rain video, and now I am talking about it here. I am going to make a Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel video because I have been doing some digging, and it is a very interesting story. It has come up over and over and over in my videos, and I just kept being like, wow, everyone had their funeral here. And it turns out, yes, everyone had their funeral there, and there is a reason why. So, side note, look out for that video because I think it's an interesting story. But anyways, back to Judy Garland. Judy Garland has died. Everybody is in mourning, and Candy Darling goes to Judy Garland's funeral. Holly, the next night, she shows up at Stonewall, where she hangs out all the time. And when she gets there, it is chaos. Holly says that she thought a bomb went off. And she gets a little closer and she sees one of her friends who she just calls Crazy Sylvia. And Crazy Sylvia is breaking a gin bottle over a cop's head. Like, it's just pure chaos. And then another one of Holly's friends, who she calls Miss Marcia, who I can only assume is the infamous Marsha P. Johnson. Miss Marcia calls Holly over and she flags her down and says, honey, get over here. The queens are holding the cops hostage. Here, have a drink. And according to Holly, Miss Marcia was having a ball. She was like apparently the head of hopper of Christopher Street. She was always had the tea and was kind of always on the corner just being like, did you hear about this? Did you hear about this person? Oh, honey, let me tell you about this. And so she's just running through the cops as the queens are holding them hostage. Everyone's beating each other up, just being like, honey, let me tell you. She's like doing running commentary of the Stonewall riots as they're happening, according to Holly. And of course, I kind of feel like, you know, Holly exaggerates and embellishes. So I don't know like how much of this is true, but it's in her memoir. So according to her memoir, Holly was there at Stonewall. She practically threw the first brick. But really, and I talked about this in my Judy Garland video, it just was the wrong night to mess with these queens. Stonewall had been raided a number of times. It was like a notorious gay bar in the city. And it had been raided over and over because it was illegal at that time to dress as a woman if you were born a man. It was kind of, I don't know that if it was actually illegal to be gay, but sodomy was illegal, I think. Anyways, it was just a rough time to be gay. So the cops had raided Stonewall many times, but what they did not understand was that Judy Garland had just died, and this was like the queen of queer underground. I mean, like, she was an icon for so many queer people. And if you want to know why, you can watch my Judy Garland video where we get into it. But it just was, they weren't having it. They were mourning, they were grieving the loss of their icon. They did not want to be messed with by the cops that night. And so I think that, of course, Holly was there at Stonewall. So Holly is still scheming on how to get into Warhol's scene and join Candy and Jackie, and she starts passing herself off as Viva, who was another one of Warhol's superstars at the time. And she she's very bold. It's so funny because like sometimes she was so nervous and shy she couldn't even ask a John for the money after turning a trick, but sometimes she could be very bold. And one of those times was she goes to this camera store that Andy Warhol had an account at, and she decides to buy a $2,000 camera and charge it to Andy Warhol's account. And she says, I'm a Warhol superstar and I am eligible. I am allowed to do this. And so she tries to buy this camera, and the store clerk is like, let me double check. And so he calls Andy Warhol. And of course, Andy Warhol is like, I don't know who this person is. And as the store clerk is like on the phone, Holly just flees. And so she escapes. She's not arrested, but she also doesn't get the camera. So that scheme did not work. Around this time, Holly kind of becomes friends again with Jackie Curtis, and Jackie Curtis is staging her epic play, Heaven Grands in Amber Orbit, which I'm a huge fan of personally, at the Playhouse of the Ridiculous. And Holly manages to work her way into being cast as a chorus girl. And so Holly's in this show. She really doesn't have much of a part, but she's in the show. But she's always scheming, and she manages to talk to a reporter who has come to review the show. And the reporter wants to interview her, and Holly says, well, actually, I'm a Warhol superstar. And so she gives this interview as a Warhol superstar, and then later Andy Warhol reads it, and everyone at the factory is like, who is this? We have no idea who this girl is who is claiming to be a superstar. But Andy knows that this is kind of a good sign, because Andy is always looking for people who will be interesting on camera. And somebody who would lie about being a superstar to the press is probably somebody who would be interesting on camera. And so Paul Morrissey, who was Andy's film director at the time, reaches out to Holly and says, hey, we want to cast you in Warhol's next film. So Paul hires Holly to be in his next film, which is Trash. And she stars with Joe D'Alessandro, who is another one of Warhol's superstars. And the Warhol style of filmmaking is, especially in the early days, was like, turn the camera on, see what happens. There's no script. There's no direction. You can barely call them films in the way that we think of films. There's no plot. There's just some stuff happening on screen. It's very like proto-reality TV, honestly. And it's evolved a little bit by this point, because now we're in like 1969, 1970, and Paul Morrissey is like trying to make this more of like a real filming operation. They still don't really have scripts, and Holly's nervous because she has never acted before. So she shows up and she's like ready to do it, but secretly she's kind of terrified. And Paul reassures her and is like, don't worry, I'm just going to tell you what the scene is generally about, and then you improvise it when we start. So just like be interesting, and like this is just the general shape of the scene, which by the way is now how pretty much all reality TV is filmed. So they're kind of groundbreaking. But so Holly, she's like, okay, I can do this. She films a couple scenes, and she kind of plays this like floozy type role, and she's a hit. She's truly a hit. Once the camera starts rolling, she just lets it rip, and everything inside of her comes out, and she's funny, she's fierce, and she does a great job. She gets paid like $25, and she goes on her merry little way. And then a friend is like, Paul tells her after the one day of shooting, he's like, call me next week and we can see the rushes. And she's like, okay. And so she goes home, and then she's like too afraid to call back. She like is very intimidated by the whole Warhol scene. And her friends are like, no, they told you to call. Like, you should call them. And she's like, no, I can't. They probably don't want to see me. I was terrible. I can't do it. And her friends keep being like, no, they told you to call them. And so eventually she calls, and Paul's like, oh, I'm so glad you called, Holly. Like, everyone loves your rushes. You got to come to the factory and see them. So she comes back to the factory, and they are good. And that kind of gives her confidence. And she's like, oh, I'm funny. I'm interesting. And so Paul's like, we actually want to film another scene with you. So come back next week. We'll film some more. And they end up filming like 3 or 4 different sessions. And so Holly's in trash, and she's like, I'm a Warhol superstar. I've done it. But before she can celebrate being a Warhol superstar, before the premiere of Trash, Holly gets in some trouble. She needs money, as always. And Holly is arrested for grand larceny for impersonating a French diplomat's wife. Oops. She goes to the bank, like she literally dresses up as this French diplomat's wife. She puts on a French accent, and she goes to the bank and tries to withdraw $2,000 from this woman's checking account. And I think she stole her checkbook. I don't know how she got in touch with this. I did learn at some point, but a friend of a friend steals something. She gets the bank information for this woman. Obviously, she is not successful. She is arrested, and she's in jail for the premiere of Trash. And so she doesn't get to go to the premiere, and she's stuck in jail. And she calls everybody. She calls Andy Warhol. She calls Holly, or Candy Darling. She calls Jackie Curtis. None of them have the money to help. Well, Andy has the money, but he won't help. Candy and Jackie, they don't have the money. And so she's just left to rot in jail as Trash premieres. And it turns out that Trash is a hit. It's actually the first mainstream Warhol film, probably because it's the first Warhol film that has any sort of plot. And Holly is like the star. And so this film is like one of the most popular Warhol films. Holly is like being hailed as like this great actress. In fact, George Cukor in Hollywood, he campaigns for Holly to be nominated for an Academy Award. So it's not just like the underground in New York that thinks Holly is great. Like, legitimate actors in Hollywood are like, this girl, she's got it. Holly misses all of this because she's in jail. And so what is really funny though is that because Holly misses the premiere because she's in jail, it only adds to her mystique. And of course, Andy loves drama and loves fame and loves scandal. And so the fact that the star of his new movie is in jail kind of works. It kind of like helps the publicity. But of course, Holly is pretty eager to get out of jail. And eventually it's Jackie Curtis that saves the day. Jackie Curtis calls Larry Rivers, who is considered kind of to be the godfather of pop art. And maybe we will do a Larry Rivers video someday. But Jackie Curtis convinces Larry Rivers to pay bail for Holly, takes Holly out of jail, and also takes her on a shopping spree because she is a star and she needs some star clothes. So it all works out in the end. Also around this time, she picks up a pretty severe heroin addiction. So she's living the life of a star, but then she gets kicked out of the Playhouse of the Ridiculous because of the heroin addiction. And I do believe John Vaccaro's direct quote was that he was refusing to work with any psychotic drag queens. And Holly took exception to that because, one, she's not psychotic, and two, she's not a drag queen. So she parts ways with the Playhouse of the Ridiculous, and she starts hanging out at Max's Kansas City. And Max's Kansas City Wow, what a place. We will make a Max's video, I'm sure, very soon. I will put it on the calendar. But Max's Kansas City was kind of like we have this lineage of like New York City nightlife that I feel that I need to explain very briefly. So we have the factory, opens in 1962. This crazy studio open 24 hours a day where you can show up and Andy might put you in a film and make you famous, or he might put you to work silk screening paintings, or the Velvet Underground might be rehearsing and rocking out. Anything could happen at the factory. Now, all these factory people, they like to party and they're always working on these crazy experimental art things. And one of those big experimental art things was something called the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. And so that was kind of this multimedia show. And they held it at the Dom in St. Mark's Place, which was a Polish community center, basically. They painted the walls white so that they could project Andy Warhol's films like on all the walls. So they had many projectors. They would project all the films. While the films were being projected, Billy Name, who was a lighting designer, would design this crazy light show while the Velvet Underground, the rock band, would play their songs. And then Gerard Malanga and Mary Warno would do these whip dances in front of the Velvet Underground. So you have crazy kind of S&M whip dances. You have the Velvet Underground doing like rock music, the films being screened, and the light show. So it's this like very like proto. It was the first time that a rock band had a light show, by the way. So like it's very like kind of the birth of concert light shows, and also the birth of like nightclubs that were kind of crazy like this. And so then the Dom becomes it's the same venue, but it becomes a place known as the Electric Circus. And so then the Electric Circus kind of takes the idea of this exploding plastic inevitable multimedia projection thing, and they make it more of a psychedelic hippie nightclub. And that lasts until like 1971. And then Max's Kansas City opens, and this becomes the new back room, the new party spot for all the factory people, and also the early punk people. Punk had not really been named yet, but like the Velvet Underground is very much like an influential part of punk. Patti Smith, David Bowie, the New York Dolls, they're all hanging out at Max's Kansas City. And of course, Holly Woodlawn, Jackie Curtis, Candy Darling are hanging out there too, along with Ondine and other factory kind of leftovers at this point. And so the glam style of Jackie Curtis, Holly Woodlawn, and Candy Darling influence these musicians like the New York Dolls and Patti Smith and people that would become part of the punk movement. And then after Max's has been there for a while, then CBGB opens and the punk movement really takes off, and also Studio 54 opens and the whole like crazy nightclub thing takes off as well. So Max's Kansas City kind of is this linchpin between the early factory days of the 60s and the punk disco of the 70s. It's like the turning point. So we're all hanging out at Max's Kansas City. Holly starts just signing all of her tabs to Andy Warhol because she's a star and she started Trash and she is a Warhol superstar, and Andy Warhol only paid her $25 for Trash and the movie is making money. So she feels like I deserve this. He should be paying my tabs. But eventually Andy puts a stop to this because Holly is really taking advantage. She like has racked up quite a bill, and she also keeps demanding that Andy pay her rent, and honestly she keeps asking for money just all the time, and so does Jackie Curtis, and so does Candy Darling. They're all kind of constantly depending on Andy to finance their lifestyles. And so one day Holly goes to the factory to ask for money. She sees Andy enter the factory, and so she calls to get buzzed in, and Pat Hackett, who is the receptionist at this point of the factory, this is the Union Square factory, not the Silver factory. We are now in Interview Magazine territory. And so Pat Hackett answers the call and it's like, oh, sorry, Andy's not here today, but maybe you can come by tomorrow. And Holly's like, I know that I just saw Andy walk in. And so she's mad and she's like, I'm going to get back at them. So she goes to the basement where Jackie Curtis had just told her where the power box was, and she turns it off, unplugs it. I don't know what she does, but she like manages to turn out all the lights at the factory. So the factory is thrown into chaos. It's dark. as the factory is freaking out about being in the dark, Holly climbs the fire escape up to the factory and starts banging on the window and is like, "It's me, it's Valerie, I'm back and I'm gonna get you and your little dog too." She's just like terrorizing Andy Warhol, who is terrified of Valerie Solanas with good reason. Valerie tried to kill Andy. So, I don't know, that story was just hilarious to me. So Holly's kind of kicked out of the factory for a while for climbing the fire escape and pretending to kill Andy. Holly's exile from the factory only lasts a little bit because Paul Morrissey gets the idea for a film that he wants to do called Women in Revolt. And Women in Revolt is basically a send-up of the women's liberation movement that was happening in the 70s, and it's also kind of a send-up of Valerie Solanas. It's about these three women who are in an organization called PIGS, which stands for Politically Involved Girls, which is kind of a nod to SCUM, the Society for Cutting Up Men. And so, the twist is that they're doing it with drag queens, Paul's words. Candy and Holly were not drag queens, but that's the idea, is that it's like about women's lib, but there's a twist. And Holly's excited, but she's also really intimidated because it's Candy and it's Jackie. And she thinks maybe this will be like a chance for them to be like girlfriends again, like old times. Sadly, that is not the case. And they are still kind of snooty to her. And also, to be fair, Holly is a drunk and a heroin addict. So she also is not on her best behavior. And also, there is a fundamental misunderstanding. Holly doesn't understand that the film is about women's liberation. She thinks it's about lesbianism. And of course, the Warhol style is there is no script. You improvise your lines. So none of Holly's lines really make sense because she thinks this is a movie about lesbianism. And so all of her improv lines are reflecting the fact that she's a lesbian and she is looking for other lesbians, but the other people in this film know that it's about women's liberation. So there's a disconnect. And anytime she's in a scene with Candy and Jackie, she kind of like folds into herself and is shy and lets them dominate the scene. And then eventually she gets into this really big fight with Candy Darling and Candy Darling's manager, and she gets kicked off the film entirely. She still films like a couple more small scenes, but she's not really a major role in the film. She was meant to be like a lead, and it doesn't really end up being that. So Holly is kind of like out of the factory world, and she's bouncing around gig to gig, hand to mouth, living with friends, doing heroin. And she starts hanging with this lady named Elda. And Elda was dating this guy who was a guitarist in the New York Dolls. And she also was doing the costumes for the New York Dolls. And so she's going to all these rock shows. And then Elda decides, hey, I'm tired of making costumes for other people to be on stage. I want to be on stage. So Elda forms a band, and she asks Holly to be in the band with her. And the band basically is them butchering show tunes, but they get hired at Reno Sweeney's, which is this brand new cabaret club in New York. And they go on stage and they kind of bomb their set. But the guy who runs Reno Sweeney's is like, Holly, pulls her aside and is like, Holly, Elda kind of sucks, but you're great. I think you should do a solo cabaret show here on Monday nights. And Holly's like, I would love to, but she also feels bad. And she's like nervous to tell Elda about the new gig. And so eventually she tells Elda like, hey, I got asked to do this gig, but I'm so sorry. Like I tried to get the whole band hired, but they didn't. They just wanted me. And Elda's like, no, girl, it's fine. It's fine. I can find another girl to be in the band. And so Elda's like, there's a girl who works at Max's as a waitress. I think she would be down. So she asks this pretty brunette girl named Debbie, who is working as a waitress at Max's Kansas City, to be in her band. Debbie comes and is part of the band for a while and then realizes, actually, I think the problem is Elda, but Debbie likes being in a band. And so her and her boyfriend, Chris, form a new band. And that band, of course, is Blondie. So in some ways, really, it's Holly Woodlawn's fault. It's thanks to Holly Woodlawn that we have the band Blondie. you could say. Holly starts doing her nightclub act at Reno Sweeney's, and it's a hit. She's the toast of the town. She's doing this act every week at least. And one night, she's doing her act, and she sees this figure all dressed in white, bleach blonde hair, sitting in the front row, and it's Candy Darling. And Holly internally is like, what is this bitch doing here? Like, they're not friends anymore. And after the show, Candy goes backstage and meets Holly and is like giving her all these compliments, and Holly is still like, she's taking the compliments. They have a friendly conversation, but she's like suspicious. She doesn't know what's up. And then a little while later, a couple days later, a friend calls and tells Holly what's really going on. And the news is that Candy is dying. She has cancer. And suddenly the visit makes a little more sense. And Jackie Curtis calls up Holly and is like, girl, Candy's in the hospital. She's sick. And so they start going to the hospital like every day, hanging out at lunch. And it's just like old times. Like suddenly Candy having cancer makes all of the competitiveness and the snottiness and the backstabbing, it all falls away. And the three girls are friends again. And Jackie and Holly visit Candy in the hospital. They also are constantly trying to get drugs from the nurses and food from the hospital and just like anything they can get their grubby little hands on. And they have a good time. Jackie, the whole time, doesn't totally believe that Candy has cancer. She thinks that maybe this is like one more of Candy's schemes to like get attention, but she goes along with it. And of course, it's not a scheme. Candy really does have cancer. And soon they find themselves back at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel for Candy Darling's funeral. And after Candy's funeral, Jackie kind of starts her downward spiral, and Jackie and Holly kind of part ways. And Jackie and Holly kind of part ways, and Holly keeps doing her cabaret act. She's living it up, and she thinks that, someday her and Jackie will get an act together. They'll do something. Of course, that doesn't happen. And Jackie in 1985 passes away from a heroin overdose, which just shocks Holly. And at the same time, in the early 80s, Holly has started to notice, like many other gay people in New York, that there's this like very mysterious pneumonia that is spreading around gay men in the city. So Holly actually starts to lose a number of her friends, and then it comes out, we discover slowly that this is not pneumonia, this is AIDS. And so people are dropping right and left. Jackie overdoses in 1985, and that is devastating to Holly because it's one of the last ties to the Warhol world. She goes to Jackie's funeral, and I thought this was very sweet. In all of the funerals that she attends in the 80s, and there are many, she always wears this blue suit, and it becomes this suit that she only wears to funerals. And she does it because she doesn't want to draw attention to herself by dressing up glamorously for funerals. It's out of respect. She doesn't want to draw attention to herself. She wants to focus on the deceased. And so she keeps living her life. She goes to Provincetown for a while, and she does a show with Divine. And then in 1987, Andy Warhol dies of complications from his gallbladder, which really was the result of the shooting in 1968. And it just, complications from that really is what caused his death. And Holly is shocked when Andy dies. And she goes to the funeral, similar to Jackie's, in her little blue suit. And she's just disgusted by the scene. Like, everyone there is trying to get media attention and trying to get their face photographed and like dressed to the nines. It's like the social event of the season. And Holly's like, I hate this. I hate these people. Like, this is gross. Why is everybody trying to get attention? And she's even invited to sit in the VIP section at Andy's funeral with all the Warhol stars, and she declines. She's like, I'm just going to sit in the back. And then afterwards, there's this big reception, and she doesn't go. She's just over it. So for the rest of her life, she does her cabaret act, and she writes her memoirs, and she lives. I think that is like the definition of Holly. She says she's not a survivor. She feels like a survivor is somebody who just hangs on till the next day, hoping for a better future. And a fighter is somebody who makes it happen. And that is what Holly is. And she lives her life, really, she lives quite a long time. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was that she says that when Jackie died, somebody said to her that you made one mistake. You didn't die. And that's kind of what makes a Warhol star, is the death. It's just as important as the beginning. Dying at the right time is a big part of what makes somebody an iconic star. And she doesn't die. She's a fighter. So she actually travels around, does her cabaret acts. Her last performance in New York was at the Laurie Beachman Theater in 2013, and she dies in 2015 in LA. And after she dies, her estate, which, by the way, crazy that she had an estate at all after so many years of living hand to mouth, and she died of cancer. And her estate, after she passes away, founded the Holly Woodlawn Memorial Fund for Transgender Youth at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. And Holly herself said this about her and her factory friends. She said, "We were the beautiful people you read about in the papers but never thought you'd meet. And you never really did meet us. You just saw the light bouncing off us as we walked by." So we're going to leave it there today. Thank you for watching this Holly Woodlawn retrospective. If you enjoyed this video, please give this video a like, hit subscribe. It means the world to me. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.